Hi everyone, it's me again, Benetta, and we're talking about anxious teens and about parents and how to deal with those problems that come up with our teens. So today's choice from me was models of the world. What does that even mean? When it was explained to me when I was first doing training, I was like, what do they mean? I've got no idea. So today I'm going to help you to understand what models of the world are. Also, how can we change not only our own model of the world, but also maybe other people's or our teams particularly. Also, what techniques can we use to do that? How will that also assist us in communicating with other people, particularly with our children? So anyway, let's talk a little bit about models of the world. We all have a different model of the world. And why that is because it's mixed up of all the things that we learn and experience in our life. So if we think about, first of all, our beliefs. What are our beliefs? Where do we get them from? And have we changed them along the way? I know I certainly have. So our beliefs when we're young come from our own, I suppose, background. So mainly our parents, could be our grandparents or a teacher, but it certainly comes from someone else and not from our own learning, okay? So when we have our belief system intact, then we might carry that all the way through our life, particularly when it's something that's been brought, through the ages. So if we have grandparents who have traditions and then they pass them down to their children, and then our children will quite often follow suit. The problem with that is that it's not always a good thing. I remember some of the things that my mother used to say that now I'm grown up and I have to think for myself. It's pretty ludicrous. I couldn't even get that word out. Ludicrous. Like, oh, you must eat everything on your plate because there's children starving in Africa. Well, yes, there always have been children starving in Africa. What that's got to do with me eating everything on my plate? Absolutely nothing, unless you're actually giving the money you would usually use for your own food and you're giving it to someone like Save the Children or Oxfam, and they would send that money on to help feed those children. Lots of other sayings, like don't walk under the ladder, because it brings bad luck. Well, maybe at some stage someone walked under a ladder and something fell on them. Of course, it's not great to walk under a ladder anyway, because you never know what's going on up there. So unless you can actually sort of I suppose, know exactly what's going on around you, and if there's no one up the ladder and the ladder's secure, then by all means, you could walk under a ladder, couldn't you? So what I'm really saying is that we start that model of the world by believing certain things. Oh yeah, her dad, that's right. She said that her dad used to tell the kids that they want a pig, they'll have to rattle a bucket. Now, yeah, it's really weird, isn't it? But of course, farmers did do that. They went onto the farm and they rattled the bucket of food, and therefore maybe the pigs would come. But we have to realize that, some of those beliefs probably need to change, particularly beliefs around us, our own ability, who we are. When you're told, well, that's just who you are. Well, yes, we certainly have personality traits. However, we can be whoever we want if we just put in the effort and we know what goals we want to achieve. And then we believe in ourselves. So I've heard many a teen come into my room and say, that's just the way I am, anxious. I'm an anxious person. I've always been an anxious person. But something has to cause the anxiety, right? There has to be an underlying cause. whereby that person didn't feel safe or was protecting themselves. So, yes, you may have a tendency to be anxious about things, but it's usually brought on by a trigger and by a belief system. So let's think about the other things that actually go into this ball, and this ball of our model of the world. We also have, of course, our experiences. We all have very varied experiences, particularly as children. And so therefore, that will also go into the mix to make this model of the world. Yeah, there's a lot of people there who say about they see themselves as one thing or another, and they think that anxiety is just them. It's not, and it can be overcome. So when we think about the experiences, though, what about if you're brought up in a household where the parents are always arguing, or where there's always conflict between the people who are there? There's toxic relationships. What about if that child is always told that they'll never achieve anything, that they're not good enough, that whatever they do, they can't achieve anything in life? What about if they see their parents and say they're never happy? They're never happy. So it creates this, I can't find happiness. I'm never going to be happy. And also there's things like, what about if the parent says, I've also always been an anxious person. I've always had depression. Therefore, you will have depression. They start to believe those things. So let's also look at our model of the world, okay? Because those experiences that we're having don't necessarily have to happen to our children, do they? If we are actually saying to them, yes, I've had depression and I know how it feels, but I feel better when I get up and have a shower, when I get up and eat some food, when I look after myself, just having my hair done, anything, or music. Music around me makes me feel more calm. And so this model of the world that we create also can create the model of the world for our children. There's also something that I feel is the most influential thing about the model of the world, and that's perception. How do we perceive the things that happen to us? How do we perceive our life? How do we perceive other people and what they might do or say to us? Because there's such a big thing about perception, isn't there? So many of my teens, when they come, are so worried about what their parents will think or what their peers will think. This comes down particularly from the parent too. If my child looks as if they haven't had a shower, if my child comes over as socially anxious and can't actually achieve things that I think they should, then that disappointment, that disapproval will definitely show up somewhere. I know myself when my son was going through some stages of depression and anxiety, that he would come out with me when he was looking disheveled, when he didn't have his hair cut, when he wouldn't wash, all those things that when people are depressed, they don't see. They don't feel it's necessary to do those things. And one of the things that really shocked me was when I said to him, why, I'm curious to know why this is happening, why you decide not to shower or, cut your nails, have your hair done. And he said, I want people to know how I feel. I want people to know how I feel. And that was quite, I suppose, a revelation for me, is that people don't see mental problems. people don't necessarily know, because he was always someone who would put a smile on his face, who would say everything was okay, when of course it wasn't okay. And the only people that he would actually say those things to were mainly myself, my husband and my daughter. But to everyone else, all his friends, because it was expected of him once he'd done that once. So the story being that he was ill with pancreatitis, and it's a very, very painful condition. But he thought that he had to put a brave face on. So he did put a brave face on. But the thing is that everyone else thought that that was for real, thought that it didn't matter, that it kept coming back, and that he would miss school and he would miss going out with his friends, and that things weren't going well in his world. So instead of actually coming clean about those things to his friends who he thought might judge him, he decided to internalize them. The fact that he looked unwell or disheveled was his way of announcing to the world that he wasn't okay. So if you have a teen who's doing that, maybe consider that what they're putting on is a front. So to sit down and say, it's okay to not be okay sometimes, right? It's okay to say, I'm having problems and I need friends or assistance or someone to talk to. So this thing about perception is pretty huge in my eyes, is that we perceive things from our model of the world. We don't perceive things from the other person's model of the world. So always be aware that with your children, when they're actually, acting up, that there is something deeper. And the way to actually approach that is to be calm about it. So what I'm offering every time that we do these sessions is a download to listen to help you to calm your nervous system and your brain. Because what you probably don't realize is that we have two parts of our brain. One is the conscious part, which is logical, and the other part is our emotional brain, which is the subconscious brain. And the subconscious brain will always kick in when we lose the plot. So as soon as we jump out of our conscious brain, which is our logical brain, and we start arguing or we start getting upset, then our emotional brain comes in and takes over. And all it's concerned about is survival and being right. So when you're arguing with your teen and the teen starts losing the plot, stop. There's no point in going any further, because they'll say something hurtful. They'll do anything they can to make themselves right and be the victim. And last week we did talk about the victim triangle, and that victim triangle and the cycle that it takes. If you don't break it, it will just continue on and on and on. So there's a nice download for you to listen to. So if you want that, put in the comments calm. And if you'd like the notes from today because you've missed today, then please put in the comments notes and we'll send those to you. It's always good as well to have those notes to look through, because there's so much that I probably don't say because I've got notes here, but of course those things all get jumbled up, but they're written down for you. So, and anybody that you think is struggling with their teen and with their own emotions, I'd love you to send this out to them and to invite them to listen to what we're saying. Hi, Judy. Yes, calm and notes. You can have both. I'm sure that it will give you some insight into how these things develop. I write these from my heart because I've been there. And so being there and sometimes doing the complete wrong thing is what teaches us how to be better prepared, right? Anyway, so let's go. The other thing that actually comes into consideration when we're doing, looking at all this putting together and making that a model of the world is personality. We all know that when we have more than one child, we can't treat them the same, because we always look back and go, well, I treat them all the same, and this one came out this way, and this one did this, and this one did this. It's because personality has a part to play. If you've got a very oversensitive child, somebody who's an empath, who actually picks up on other people's emotions and energies, you will definitely find that they will fit into these brackets of emotional, anxious, depressed children somewhere along the line. Hopefully it won't last, because if you actually treat it in a certain way, it will start to dissipate and they'll be a lot better. It may never be the way that we imagine, because our imagination is one thing and how they perceive things and deal with things is completely different. Oh, Judy, I feel so sorry for you if your teens are both this way. And sometimes being around that sort of, I suppose, emotional toxicity or trauma can actually set the other one off. So when you've got teens who are both like this, it's very difficult. However, they can help one another, because if you get one onto this cycle of cutting down this emotional trauma or this anxiety that they have, the other one could quite easily follow, because, you know, when one does something, the other one does. When they were growing up, I'm sure you found that one would decide to walk and then the other one would follow. One would decide to speak and say something, the other one would follow. Yeah, sometimes it does get crazy, Julie. I know the feeling. And that chaotic, I suppose, feeling, that feeling that the energy is all wrong, can also create this drama triangle too. The more calm that we can be during those times of chaos, the better. So I hope that you get a lot from listening to the 10 minutes of calm, so that you can start to calm your own nervous system down. And also it helps you to think logically about solutions, and to sit down with your teens and say, you know what, if we want something better, we have to do this thing of creating harmony, creating calm out of the chaos. There's also something on my website, if you'd like to check it out, called Chaos to Calm. And it's a program whereby you have a look at all the things that are going on around you, and you can actually work out a solution on how to break those chaotic cycles. So let's talk one more thing, because we haven't got too much time left. But how can we change someone's model of the world? It can be quite simple. If we just challenge their beliefs. One of the things that I do with my teens particularly is to challenge their beliefs. When they say about anxiety, I ask them, so what is anxiety? How do you know you have it? And they say, well, I just get anxious about things. So is it anxious about something that you need to be anxious about, or is it anxious about everything? And we go through a process of challenging their belief system. That is a really big eye-opener and a light bulb moment for a lot of them. Some people come in and say, I have depression and anxiety. So how do you know which is which? What has your psychiatrist or psychologist told you about those things? And sometimes they don't even know. It's just that they've been diagnosed and therefore they have. And it's almost as if they're now wearing that label of, I'm an anxious person. I have depression. I am depressed. until we actually start digging deep and seeing what it's all about. What about if we reframe their perception? So what is their perception on anxiety? What is their perception about how you can leave it behind? What is their perception about why they're so involved in what people are thinking? Do people really think that about them? How do they know? So there's lots of questions that are asked of them so that they start to think, and we start to reframe how they perceive what's happened to them. What about if we show them better ways of filling their human needs? So many of my teens actually say they have social anxiety, that they can't possibly meet people. So what about if they could meet people on social media? What about if they could just say one or two words to someone? What about if they could just be themselves in front of that person and see if they're liked? See if that other person can like them, especially if they've got the same interests, because I know that when my son was depressed, he would just constantly talk about gaming and what game did this and what game did that and who he was in that game. And I particularly didn't have much of an insight or an interest into what he was talking about. But when he talks to people who have, guess what? He starts to forget that he needs to be anyone other than himself. So we start to introduce them to some sort of social interactions whereby they don't have to, I suppose, be anyone or be anything. So let's have a look as well about how experiences can just be learning. So one of the things I say to them is, what about if you didn't have expectation? What about if you just did something for the joy of it, or to try it out, or to see if you like it? Because so many times we have expectations, don't we? Particularly where money is involved, because I know that, people have expectations, and I like to ask the parents of my teens, what expectations do you have from the work that I'm doing with them? Because if we go from not having great expectation, but just knowing that just being there and talking to somebody and doing something is better than doing nothing. And quite often they're blown away by how quickly their teens will actually start to change and think for themselves. And that's what we really need, isn't it? For them to find solutions for themselves. Because as parents, we can push and push and find solutions. However, we really need our teens to find their own solutions. So what about if we can give them a can-do attitude? So even if it's getting in the shower, even if it's eating something, even if it's going out for a walk or talking to somebody, you can do it. If you look back at the segment that I did on the drama triangle or the victim triangle, when we change that, we start to ask them to try things. And then when they do, we give them a can-do attitude. You can do it. See? You can go outside and walk. You can have a coffee with a mate. You can read a book. Whatever it is, let's give them the can-do attitude. The one big thing, I think, is to build some resilience. It's been difficult in Melbourne, and if you live in Melbourne, Judy, if you live in Melbourne, you know that having 4 lockdowns has been pretty difficult for all of us, not only for our teens, but for ourselves too. If we sit and complain the whole time about having to do this, then of course our children are probably going to watch that and take that on. So let's also give them a bit of resilience. Let's also say to them, come on, what can we do today that would just bring a smile to our face? What about if we just watched Netflix together? What about if you helped me cook dinner? There's so much that we can do that breaks this monotony or this boredom. Quite often they'll say, I'm bored. Say, okay, well, I'll give you a couple of suggestions. You choose one. If you ask them to choose one initially before we start this whole process of finding their own solutions, you'll find that they will not want to do anything. So my advice to you is just give them two things, right? This or that, you choose. That way, the brain, the subconscious brain, goes, oh, I've only got two choices, this or that. Let me choose. And if they're still undecided, say, okay, if you were in a lift, you went up to the top floor and the doors opened and there was two things waiting in front of you, which one would you choose? And if they're not still coming to the party, you click your fingers. Choose now. Just like that. Because this is a trick for the subconscious brain. We have to trick those subconscious brains sometimes into flicking back into the conscious brain. And once we flick into the conscious brain, the logical part of us will take over. So we're nearly out of time. So I'm just going to say one more thing. And that is that if we want things to change, we also have to change. So we also have to change some of the things that we think, some of the things we do, some of the things we say. There's three things that I always say will start to bring harmony. One, effort. And it takes effort on everyone's part, not just one, because if things are going to change, we need a bit of effort from everybody. And giving that to our teens and saying, you know what, if you are unhappy, then you need to change. Let's think of some ways, because we need a bit of compassion too, right? The compassion of your model of the world and my model of the world. It doesn't always match up, particularly if they've had some trauma to cause this anxiety. So we have to have compassion about that. And quite often I know I've said, you have nothing to be depressed about. You have nothing to worry about. Whereas actually the worries of a teen is completely different to the worries we have. And so looking at it with compassion. And the third is to compromise. Yes, sometimes we want things to be our way, but it's not always possible in that instance. So if we work at it, if we put in the effort, then we can find some compromises, can't we? As to how they see things, how we see things, and also to give them a little bit of room for maneuver. Because we want them to have that can-do attitude. And we want them to have all the things that we know that life can bring if they really put in some effort. You see, when they're young, we tell them you can be anything, do anything. However, we sometimes forget to tell them that it takes a lot of effort to get to the top. It takes a lot of effort sometimes to even get out of bed. But the more you do it, the more you know that you can, and that it makes you feel better if you're up and out and doing something and eating something, because it's all holistic. It's one big ball. We can't separate one thing from another. But if we start the ball rolling, then yes, things can change. And I have something else. Yes, I think more things should be taught in school, Joanne. Absolutely on your side. And in fact, I am trying at the moment to get my program into schools so that we can do something from that level. You see, a lot of them have anti-bullying, I suppose, protocols. But there'll always be some bullies there. There'll always be someone who wants to put you down. However, what I want to teach is resilience, is respect, is how to, I suppose, get the best out of yourself. No matter what you're suffering or how life is treating you, how to get the best out of yourself. And I think really, particularly for girls, it would be good to do some self-defense, because then they feel that they have the power, not only mentally, but physically, to actually take someone down. I'd like to hear your comments about that if possible. So if you've got any comments about this, I suppose taking it into schools and teaching all those things, I'd love to hear how you feel about that. So just one more time, I'll tell you that there is a download that you can have to help yourself and even your teen to become more calm. So if you'd like that sent to you, put calm in the comments. And if you'd like the notes from today, please put notes and we will send them straight to you as soon as possible. Anyway, that's all for today. And I hope you really enjoyed hearing about models of the world. And maybe it'll make you think a little bit about where you're coming from, how you're teaching, and how you're showing up as well for your teens, as well as how they're showing up in the world. So thank you for joining me today, and I'll say goodbye for now, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.